Good evening, everybody. It's delightful to see you all here. My name is Robert Collins. I'm the senior producer at the Global Debate Forum, Intelligence Squared. We are so happy to be here tonight on the eve of the Page Ministerial Conference 2017, being hosted by the Partnership for Action on Green Economies, and also by the Ministry here in this delightful setting where we are. And we're thanking them very much for having us. This evening sits a little bit outside of the conference, in affiliation with the conference, and it's being hosted by us at Intelligence Squared. We're headquartered in London, and also by the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. And it's a delight to be doing this with them, and also especially to be welcoming our extremely distinguished panel of speakers, and also you here. Many of you here this evening are from the Hertie School of Governance here in Berlin. We've heard questions from you in advance, and we're going to be coming later to you in the discussion to hear those questions so that you can put them to the panel and enter into a dialogue with them. Just to give you a little bit of detail about how this evening works, you'll see that there are cameras around you. It's being filmed. Please be mindful of them. The event will go out on Intelligence Squared later on in a week or so. It's also being recorded for a podcast which will go out to 1.5 million followers around the world from the Intelligence Squared audience. We are discussing tonight a question which goes to the heart of the themes of the conference which all of you have come from far and wide to attend. The theme this evening is whose prosperity? How can we build inclusive and sustainable economies? You don't have to look very far to feel that globalization is at something of an inflection point. It's a moment where a lot of people are stopping and pausing to ask what it's doing. Whatever your political sensibility or affiliation, most would agree that globalization has brought a huge amount of good to a huge amount of people. It's raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Statistics show that, in fact, since the financial crisis of 2008, income levels for the poorest have actually risen out of absolute poverty in a significant way. But on the other hand, I think all of us are aware of the enormous amount of inequality which has been produced and generated by these forces of globalization. One stunning statistic released by Oxfam in their report earlier this year is that currently the 8 richest people on the planet own the same wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people on the planet. Whatever you expect to hope and to achieve from globalization, I think it's clear, I think everybody would acknowledge that such inequality is going to put enormous strains on democracies around the world, something that we're even seeing not just in the developing world, but even now in the developed world, in political events in the UK and the US, and the rise of populism and populist parties in Europe. Clearly, this is something we need to be studying and examining. Bringing into that as well are the huge environmental strains that the world is being put under by these forces. Is there a different way of us imagining the economic models that we're all currently pursuing? That's the question we're going to be asking tonight, and asking how can that environmental agenda, how can the business growth agenda be reconciled and negotiated? These are not simple issues to resolve, but to help ask those questions and help resolve them this evening, we have an incredible panel of speakers representing, we're delighted to say, the entire array of organizations who are working to resolve such issues. I'll introduce them now. To let you know how the evening is going to work, we're going to speak for a little while here. There'll be some discussion on stage. Each of the speakers will have a moment to speak on a specific question. We will then come to you, and we look forward to hearing your questions. So first, sitting here, we have Winnie Byanyima. She is the Executive Director of Oxfam International, a position she's held since 2013. She previously served as Director of Gender and Development at the United Nations Development Programme and was a senior diplomat and politician in Uganda. Next to her, Professor Tim Jackson. He's the Professor of Sustainable Development at the University of Surrey. He's been at the forefront of international debates about sustainable development for over 2 decades, and he is the author of Prosperity Without Growth: Foundations for the Economy of Tomorrow. Sitting next to him, Minister Esther Byer-Suckoo. She is Barbados's Minister of Labour, Social Security and Human Resources Development. She was formerly Minister of Family, Youth, Sports and Environment and General Secretary and Vice President of the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners. Sitting next to her, we're delighted to have Elliot Harris, a UN Assistant Secretary General and head of the UN Environment Programme's New York office. He previously worked in the Fiscal Affairs and Strategy and Policy Department at the IMF. And finally, Dr. Jürgen Heraeus. He is the chairman of the supervisory board of Heraeus Holding, a leading technology firm here in Germany. He is the current chair of the B20, the Business 20, during the German G20 presidency. He also serves as chairman of the board at UNICEF in Germany and the Zoological Society of Frankfurt. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel. We're going to start off by asking each of you a question in the plethora of issues we're trying to resolve now and reconcile. We're going to put it to you. What is the single policy that you would like to see enacted to help build more sustainable and inclusive economies? Winnie, if we'll begin with you, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and Oxfam to this discussion. You know, we people in the developing countries, in spite of the benefits of globalization, have been skeptical about it. It is good now to see more people in the North also questioning globalization, especially since the political upheavals of 2016, the Brexit vote, the election of Trump, the rise of the far right. It's good we are all now questioning globalization. You ask me, what is the one policy? That one policy change. Well, I think a good starting point would be to look at giving everyone a decent job, decent jobs. Wages in the low-skill sectors have been falling behind production for a long time, while pay at the top, wages at the top, have continued to skyrocket. Mostly in the emerging economies, but also in the rich countries, wages at the bottom have been stagnating. When you talk about the success of globalization, for me, what I see are millions of women working for poverty wages with no rights in the export processing zones you see in all these developing countries. I can give you an example of Myanmar. We did a research there amongst young women working for textile factories that produce the clothes we wear in the main brands like Gap, like H&M, and so on. These women work 6 hours a day, work for $4 a day. If they get pregnant, they may be fired. These are the conditions under which they work, poverty wages. This is not a success story for the millions of people. It's a story of inequality. So here's the one policy I would go for, that every government establishes a minimum wage that is a living wage, and that there's legislation to regulate, to put a ratio between pay at the top and pay at the bottom that's not more than 20:1. And this is not unrealistic. We're seeing progress in this direction. Last year, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam at the ASEAN World Economic Forum meeting proposed that there is a regional minimum wage to stop this race to the bottom where companies push governments to lower wages, take away workers' rights, lower tax rates in order for big business to make profits for a few. So we need more than one policy, but this is the one policy I'm putting on the table. We need to unrig an economy that has been structured to benefit a few at the expense of the majority, And that's the economy we should turn our backs on and make an economy for the majority that benefits the majority.
Winnie, thank you. Tim, an economy for the majority. It's something Winnie and Oxfam are working towards all the time. You're the economist. How do we do it?
An economy that works for everyone, absolutely agree with that. But Winnie, was it one policy or was it two? Was it the living wage or was it the ratio between the upper and the lower wage, or was it both? Can we have two? Can we have two each?
You can.
Can Winnie
you
take
can have 1.5.
One of mine. And okay, so I mean, I did think of a policy which outlawed anyone thinking that one single policy could change all of these issues. But
that's the good one.
But I do see the point that we have to somehow get to the crux of where things are, and I think actually Winnie's description of work as a fundamental parameter of an economy that works for everyone is really nice. I mean, first of all, if you're asking whose prosperity, you have to think about what prosperity means. And the typical assumption, the conventional assumption has been that it just means growing the GDP as fast as we can, as far as we can, and hoping that the poorest will catch up to the richest. And we have not seen that happening, which is exactly why the sorts of policies that Winnie's pointed out are really important. But when you start from that question, what is prosperity, then you begin to get a different kind of answer, and you learn from ordinary people or from philosophy or from literature or from studies of well-being or from community studies on the ground. You learn that it's about our quality of life, it's about our health, it's about the education of our kids, it's about the security of our neighborhoods, it's about our sense of community, it's about our sense of purpose and identity in the world. And actually, a huge part of that sense of purpose and identity in the world comes from participating in society. And in a society where there is work to be done, are there sick people? Yes, of course there are. Are there kids to be taught? Yes, of course there are. Are there buildings to be refurbished? Are there infrastructures to be transformed to low-carbon structures? Yes, of course they are. In a world where there is so much work to be done, it has to be a key part of a policy framework to ensure that on the one hand, people have that right to work which guarantees them a sense of participating in society, and on the other hand, the work that needs to be done gets done. So the economist Hyman Minsky once said that government should think of itself always as employer of last resort. It should always make sure that we're aiming for full employment. But if you ask the question, how does it get to that? Governments are too often hamstrung, in particular, by financial systems. So in addition to the work-related thing that Winnie has gone for, I'd like to point to the financial system and say, actually, we have to have a financial system that works for everybody. We have to have a money system that works for everybody. And in particular, we have to reverse the huge inequality that comes out of a money system where 97% of the money supply is created at interest by private banks. And so my single policy, I think, would be to return to something like a sovereign money system, a full reserve money system, which actually gives governments once again the freedom, as is their right to have, to invest in their societies, to create health systems that work, to create education systems that work, and yes, to be the employer of last resort. Some sort of sovereign money system that would facilitate that power of government to invest in society and reduce the huge inequality that at the moment comes through the financial system.
What conceivably would be the first steps towards creating such a sovereign money system?
Well, you could do, as 3 or 4 countries have done, you could at least go out and look at how that works. So Iceland, for example, there's an inquiry going on right now. What would that mean? How would you make the balance sheets work? What would the role of the central bank be in such a system? How would the government ensure that you avoided hyperinflation in a sovereign money system? And indeed, at the more ground-based level, making sure that those institutions that are currently investing in the right way, through peer-to-peer lending schemes, through shared interest, through community development, through green bonds, that all of these initiatives are working properly and thoroughly, supported by government with an appropriate legislative framework.
Minister, Esther, we've talked already about sort of the desire of governments to promote employment, full employment, under huge strains. Talk to us a little bit about what the obstacles are to that, and we're very aware that on the panel, you're the person at the front line of that. You're the Minister for Human Resources Development. What is it, or rather, which are the levers you're seeking to push very specifically to achieve that? And what are the biggest obstacles in the way to you?
Okay, well, first of all, let me say thanks for having me here. And I want to say thanks to my Prime Minister, because he was to have been on this panel, and he is not. But I think it's quite fortuitous, because otherwise Labour would not have been here. So I think as a Minister of Labour, it is important that I am at this discussion, because I believe when we're talking about inclusive and sustainable development, that we have to talk about labour. When he mentioned, and rightly so, wages, and that's important. In Barbados, this discussion on inclusive and sustainable development centers really around the greening of our economy. Barbados is a small island developing state, and as such it is imperative to us that we green our economy. And at the same time, we're taking the opportunity to ensure that greening our economy means also development, not just economic development, but multidimensional. Social development, as well as development of our people, and in all other areas as well, environmental and so on. So this is the focus for us right now in Barbados, greening our economy. And we want to ensure that as we change systems in Barbados, because greening the economy means that we have to change a lot of our systems. Barbados's main producer is tourism. And there's a lot of greening that has to happen in tourism, because while it does bring us jobs, and our Minister of Tourism is now on record as saying that in another 5 years, Barbados will have full employment through tourism. And that's fine, and I laud him for that, and I'm right behind him, because we want full employment. We have not recovered yet from the economic crisis of 2008. Our unemployment figures are coming down, but they're not yet where we want them. So tourism is fine, but a lot of what happens in tourism is not sustainable. So we have to ensure that there is sustainable practice going on in tourism. It means that we have to change the way a lot of things happen in tourism. The main policy I would like to see implemented, certainly at a local level, is dialogue. Because if we to mandate dialogue, in Barbados we have a process of social partnership, a social partnership that is perhaps lauded around the world, tripartite, where government, employers, and workers come to the table and we discuss a number of things. But it's voluntaristic. And with globalization, we have a lot of companies coming into Barbados that don't really understand that way of doing things, and so they make their own decisions, and we are just kind of left playing catch-up. Now, for our economy to grow, we're a very small economy, and we do encourage foreign direct investment. But at the same time, we need to encourage that those players coming into our market, dialogue. We need dialogue at the government level, agency to agency, ministry to ministry. We need government at the dialogue at the national level as well. But we also need dialogue with our multinational enterprises that come into Barbados, so that they can dialogue not just with government, but with the representatives of labor and all the other stakeholders, the CSOs, civil society organizations, and so on, to ensure that what they are doing in Barbados redounds to the benefit of all the people. It's not just for them. And when I talk policy, I think one of the things I want to see happen, not at the national level, but perhaps at the global level, is that we have agencies like WTO and the OECD that mandate a lot of what else happens. They tell us about correspondent banking. They tell us about double taxation agreements and being transparency. They tell us about trade and trade agreements. But nobody is really looking at the things that really matter, at how these trades, how this business affects society, how it affects lives. And I think that is where the dialogue needs to happen as well, that some agency, not just government, but some agency, overarching agency, in the same way WTO and OECD monitor the economic and fiscal matters, somebody needs to monitor how these transactions impact the lives of people. So that's where I want to see dialogue. So dialogue at every level. There's a lot I want to say, but if I had to put it all in one word, I'd say dialogue. From the community level right up nationally right to the global multilateral fora as well.
And in terms of a country such as Barbados, entering into dialogue with these multinationals, obviously bringing investment that you want, but you want in the right way, in a way that works for your workforce in the right way. Are you saying that there is an agency missing in order to do this mediation and to facilitate this dialogue?
Perhaps not missing, but I think that the whole concept of coherence, everybody knowing what the other one is doing, so that you know, I think when you come to the table, and that's why I said I'm glad as a Minister of Labour I am here, so that when you're at the table, all the necessary agencies and stakeholders are talking to each other at the same time. On paper, they may all be part of the process, but if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, then it's not dialogue.
So it's a matter of connecting the dots between all these agencies.
Exactly.
I think we should come back to this later to ask specifically what it is you'd like to be seeing different sectors doing in that.
Indeed.
Elliot, appropriately, we will come to you now from the UN perspective. Of course, within all these desires and aspirations, there's a planet to protect as well. We want the best for populations, the best for the workforce. We also need to do all of this, as Tim, you talk about as well, within the frame of not just protecting the most vulnerable people, but protecting the vulnerable structure within which all economy is happening. How do we fit in the environmental agenda into all of this?
Thank you, Robert. If you had asked me this question 3 years ago, when I was just starting in on this job, I would have said what we need to do is make sure that we can understand and price the externalities that have led us to this situation where it seems to be okay to pursue economic gain at the expense of social balance and environmental health. But over the last 3 years, my views have changed a bit. I think the question of getting the prices right is still paramount. But getting the prices right alone isn't going to do it, unless those prices are fed into a new business model that does not have at its heart the focus exclusively on profit to the detriment of everything else. Now, I think that we're at another inflection point, not just in the whole process of globalization, but in the process of what people expect from private business. And I really do want to emphasize this point. Tim, I'm going to disagree with you in a very violent way. I absolutely do not want to see governments being in the lead on all of this. For one simple reason, governments can't. They don't have the capacity and they certainly don't have the resources. They may have the best of will, but even that can't be guaranteed now, as we can see from some of the recent outcomes. But if you think about how much taxation a government would have to impose in order to have the resources to do 1/100th of what needs to be done, you realize that we pretty soon end up with a rather centralistic and dirigistic system. No, this has to come from business. But what has to happen is that the way business operates has to change. And so if you were to ask me what is the one policy I would recommend, I would say disclosure. Disclosure of the impact of business activities. All right? Now, it's starting to happen already. We see it happening in many stock exchanges around the world, where the stock exchanges are either requiring their listing companies to disclose their environmental footprint, or encouraging them to do so and hoping to support them as they move towards that. But the fundamental issue here is that if you have to disclose, then you have to measure. And if you measure what you're doing, then you can manage it. If you haven't got the information, you're not going to manage it. If you're unaware of what your impact is, you can't correct for any negative impact. And we see more and more that there is a tendency, a trend developing toward what I would call, and what we call now in UNEP-FI, positive impact investing. Yeah, which is that investors are looking for opportunities to invest in a way that on net basis is positive. It may have certain downsides, but when you add up all the positives against all the negatives, you end up with something that contributes. And I think if we have disclosure as the driving principle, disclosure across the entire economy, across the entire society, we will know what we are doing, we will know what the impact of what we do is on the environment, on our social outcomes, and we can manage our way towards the kind of agreed outcomes that are represented in the Sustainable Development Agenda. So I'd leave it at that.
Thank you. Jürgen, we've had Winnie talking about what needs to be done in terms of development, Tim talking about what governments can do, Esther at the sharp end of government action, talking to multinationals. Elliot is saying full disclosure from companies all around the world. You're the chairman of a large company, a privately owned company that has business everywhere. From your own perspective as a business leader, how possible do you see that? And perhaps importantly, how do you see the potential for other big companies that aren't on the stage?
I think we exactly heard the problems already in this, from these four people talking. And now we see it globally. I put some words of inequality and of dialogue. I'll start with the inequality. Inequality to measure who is a standard. You compare Germany with Greece, you compare Greece with Africa, then you compare some countries in Africa. So what is the standard? This is one. The dialogue, the B20 is a part of the G20, the 20 world leading countries that have about 85% of the GDP. And we try the business part, and then there's the labor part, and so on. And we try to communicate, to make statements to the G20 politicians. We have 7 groups, 7 task forces with up to 100 people, and try to convince each other that at the end the statement we find is not a very soaped, nothing to say, but to get an agreement, not with majority. And this is unbelievably difficult. Now, especially now with the US, they are against everything, which never was before. So, as you asked for making more dialogues, I think we have had so many dialogues, especially if I've participated on many of these events like this in the last months. Yes, everybody is right, but nothing is done. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to do something. Yes? And if I look on the business, as long as companies have to work for their shareholders, pension funds, and so on, they are measured on the interest rate, on the dividends, on the growth, and so on. We are a family-owned company. It's much easier. We do this since 160 years. So profit is okay, but it's not the only measurement. We are not under pressure because our shareholders are modest in their behavior. They do everything. They're driving small cars and so on. But they have it since generations, and I hope it stays like this. But if I've been chairman of the supervisory board of an MDAX company, it's a totally different world. It's a totally different, if they are 2% down and in the forecast, then the president, the CEO knows that maybe another 2 years he has a chance to stay and then he will be fired. So this is the system, and to change the system, I think is very, very difficult. And I think we have, if we look for the poorest, which is especially Africa, we have to change the way that we spend the money. In 50 years, we spent billions and billions and nothing happened. And I think one of the reasons, and we have the discussion if it should be budget help or if it should be project help, but our dream that we should turn these countries to our thinking of human rights, of democracy, and so on, and try to put this all together, and then start to work. This doesn't work. And if we see in the comparison the Asian countries who have been 50 years ago on the same level, South Korea, Taiwan, they are fantastic today. Singapore, everybody says Singapore, but they are not democratic. My God, I think Singapore is one of the best run countries in the world. So, They don't want to do what we think, but they did it in their way. So I think we have to change a little bit in, most of them were autocratic systems. So if the ruler is good, it's great. We need a democracy to get rid of the ruler if he's not good. But to start, I think we have to give them their own freedom, their ownership, and start in the beginning, accept inequality. If I look, we are here in Berlin, which was East and West, and the former DDR, more or less they were equal, nobody had anything. And after the 20 years, we have an inequality. Those who took the chance, especially young women, who left the country, the eastern part, went to the south. They left the men, young men, who were not flexible, who then turned for not right-wing, who were frustrated with no women, and put power in the eastern part of the country. So we had to accept inequality to get the things moving.
It's interesting that you've pointed to precisely this shift away from the thinking of, we used to think about developing economies in terms of what can rich countries do for developing economies. What we're starting to look at now, and which Esther has spoken so articulately about as well, the idea, of course, what can those developing economies do for themselves? How might developing economies want to autonomously create themselves as sustainable green economies for their own purposes, not for some greater rich world Western agenda, so to speak. But Jürgen, just quickly, before I want to come back to you, Winnie, on this as well, what would you like to see in terms of promoting green economies in the developing world in particular? What would you like to see the UN doing, perhaps, that it's not doing?
I think it will not work that we convince the people to be better people, not to go in their vacations, use the planes and do this not, and do this not, and do this not. You will get 10%, maybe 20% of the people who do this. The rest, we have to give a bonus, we have to give incentives, we have to do something that they find out. Like for instance, I suggested in China, where price for electricity and water is nearly zero, because they said people cannot afford. They said, okay, so say for a household for 2 or 3 people, the basic need is very, very low, and then you have a progressive price. The more, when they take more electricity for TV, for this, then they have to pay, then to pay. Then that makes sense. For the same for water. If I look on my water consumption, when my 5 daughters were at home showering, I don't know, hours, now they are at university and pay themselves, have to pay the water, and I pay now 1/10 what I paid before. So, I mean, if there would have been an increase in the price up a certain amount, then it works. To hope that by preaching and you get the same community who like in the church, they are always the same. They are already convinced, and I think the price is still one of the leading things. And put the others on top, and then you can convince more. Like the garbage separation in Germany is great. I think people have learned this. And the yellow sack is for free, so you can easily put it.
Precisely on that point, we're going to come to questions from you in the audience very soon now. Winnie, precisely on that point of sort of moving away from the aid idea to facilitating economies to be entrepreneurial on their own, facilitating and enabling women into the workforce and the huge dramatic change that can have. In terms of all of that, all of these Jürgen has just pointed to the fact, of course, people aren't going to do things for the good of the environment, especially in the private sector, arguably, just for the sake of it. Oxfam, I understand, is moving far more into advocacy and pressure rather than aid itself. How do you see this renewable green agenda fitting in to the poverty alleviation?
We've just been talking about economic inequality, globalization. Globalization is like a high-stakes game without a referee. We have a situation where rich countries sit and write the rules for themselves and then claim victory. We have, and this is not going to continue, with a multipolar world, with emerging economies, the system is collapsing because more and more countries are speaking out and saying it's not fair. Take the tax rules. We need a global corporate tax reform because actually the developing countries lose more from tax dodging than the rich countries. Big business is having a field day, taking money out of the developing countries, avoiding taxes. $8 trillion is sitting in tax havens of wealthy people's money, is sitting in tax havens untaxed. That's money that's socially useless. It's not tax, it's not paying for hospitals, for roads, for schools in the countries where the production is done. We're asking for a global corporate tax reform so that these companies pay where they make their production and pay their fair share of taxes. And we won't need aid. We won't need to be lectured about aid if the companies, the multinationals, pay their fair share of taxes. That's just one reform. You can talk about trade rules themselves. Developing countries have to find 60 billion or more money to pay for the medicines that they need because of all the rules on intellectual property rights that deny them access to basic things like malaria, like basic treatment. Global rules have been made to favor those who had technology and capital before others, and then others continue to sink. Let me also raise the issue of the environment. It's a case of extreme inequality because we know that global warming is driven overwhelmingly by the emissions of the extremely rich. And who pays the price? Who is on the front lines of climate change and fighting for survival? It's the developing countries, it's the poor people there. My poor uncle, who is a farmer, it would take him 180 years to emit the same emissions that an average American emits in 1 year. That's the difference. And he and farmers like him are the ones who are facing extreme weather conditions today. So where's the money to address that, to the additional cost of development that has been caused by the emissions of the super rich? So I think that we need to talk about global structures, a rigged economy that needs new structures of global governance that will make the economy fair for all. We need to separate money from politics because we also know that it is the big companies and the super rich who are influencing public policy. Take the case of climate change. The fossil fuel companies pay hundreds of thousands of dollars per day to lobby Brussels and Washington, D.C. to deny climate science, to pretend there's no climate change, to slow policy action to stop global warming. We've seen it since Trump was elected, reversing action that was meant to protect poor people from climate change. The Koch brothers, the 8th richest people in the world, are funding the climate denial machine full time. That's their main job right now. So I just want to put the issues of social and environmental justice on the table here. We need an economy that doesn't treat people, particularly women, and the environment as just exploitable resources. We need to change the global rules and make an economy that works for all of us and that protects our planet, because that's all we have.
Global tax reform, let's try and come to that before we close as well. But just very briefly, Esther, I wondered if you would take up on that point. We're talking about sort of the greening movement that's happening in a country such as Barbados. Are there specific things that you feel very quickly, very instantly, could help Barbados as a country transition to a sustainable economy? What are the obstacles being put in your way, if any, right now in the broader community? World community?
Yeah. One of the obstacles that I'm facing, this is why I mentioned dialogue, and not dialogue in the sense of having a meeting, but dialogue in the sense that the players, especially the foreign investors, Barbados depends heavily on foreign direct investment, which is what I was saying earlier. And as you said, we need a referee, we need a global referee, because one of the challenges is ensuring that when our foreign investors come, because we need their input in our development, and they understand that there is a process for doing an environmental impact assessment. But we need to have a larger conversation. It cannot just be a conversation about the impact that your construction will have on the environment. We need to discuss the impact that your construction and your business will have on our society, will have on jobs, on knowledge transfer. Because what happens in Barbados, and in a lot of countries in the Caribbean, I know for a fact, when the investors come to Barbados, they may agree that to our environmental rules, and there are a lot of concessions that they get to come and so on, but then they bring all the jobs with them, or they bring all the high-level jobs with them, and we just get the laborers. Mm-hmm. And they need to agree to knowledge transfer over maybe over a period of time, so that we do get that human resource develop the capacity locally. That's one of the things that we need to see. The money, we are not a tax haven, we're a low tax jurisdiction, but again, the money leaves the country. Very little of it is invested back in Barbados. And that is something else that we need a global referee. I like the term global referee. We need somebody to be able to say, but hold on, this benefits you, the enterprise. It benefits your country, which is by and large a developed country in most cases. It's not benefiting these little countries that you have come to work. We do insist on the wages, and this is why I say dialogue, where everybody is at the table, where the trade unions are at the table, where the government is at the table, the policymakers, the town planners, developing agencies, and everybody is at the table, so that we can talk about how what you are doing here isn't just benefiting your business, how it is benefiting us. As far as developing a green economy, we are trying to establish, to train our people with the innovation, for the innovation that is needed to green a lot of enterprises. But with very limited fiscal space, we still require the foreign investment. So the argument is still the same. We require the foreign investment. So we want to see tourism done in a greener way. So all the multinational, the big hotel chains that we know around the world, when they come to Barbados, when they come to the Caribbean, everybody wants to have a hotel, what part of their chain in the Caribbean? It's paradise. But when they come, what's your footprint? What's the footprint that you're leaving there? You're not leaving, how are you helping to develop the society? How are you leaving the environment? Are you leaving it better than you found it? These are the things that we need to ensure that all who come to invest will make our place better for us as well, not just for them.
Jürgen, did you want to come back? I sense you wanted to say something in this. A global referee, foreign business doing business differently.
Yeah, you blame the companies that make some money and so on. But I see the same in Africa. When the Chinese build a school for UNICEF, then they bring 100 people. I don't know why the country says, "You stay out. You stay out. We can build, or at least 50% or 80% of the employees will come from us." The countries, they have to take the responsibility, and the leaders shouldn't take the money. If you look on Nigeria, they are rich on all sorts of minerals, and the people are poor. And where does the money go? So it's not a blame always on the industry from foreign. It's a blame on the corrupt managed governments.
But that's not necessarily so.
Not in Barbados.
No, I'm not. Thank you. But no, sometimes the governments cannot say, take your money, we don't need it. Because the truth is, sometimes the governments do. If it is not for the help of these governments, they wouldn't be able to have the schools and the roads and all the infrastructure that they need. So they do need the help. But the thinking has been, he who pays the piper calls the tune. What we need is somebody to say, well, yeah, that makes sense, yes, but if you're going to come into the country, you also have to leave something behind, assist in some way.
Really, it's not about pointing fingers.
No.
We have a rigged economic model. There's a role for governments and there's a role for the private sector. But let me talk about the private sector, the kinds of business models that we need. We know, to give you an example, in the UK, companies were giving, in the 70s, companies were giving their shareholders 10% of profits. 10% of the profits to their shareholders as dividends in the 70s. Today, that percentage is 70% going to their shareholders. Cocoa farmers in the 80s were getting 18% of the price of a chocolate bar. Today, they get 6% of the price of a chocolate bar. Something is wrong. We have an extreme form of shareholder capitalism that is short-term kind of business that's pumping money from workers, suppliers, consumers, and handing it just to rich shareholders. We don't have companies that work for everybody, that benefit a worker, that benefit a supplier, that like a woman cocoa farmer, that benefit a consumer. No, it's companies benefiting their rich shareholders primarily. This is a wrong form of capitalism. We are looking for an unrigged economy that benefits all. We have businesses that don't work like that. And we want governments to promote those kinds of businesses that benefit everybody. It can be different, and governments need to step back and play their role, get out of a cozy bed with business, just doing what business wants. Put down the taxes, put down the wages, take away people's rights so that big business can maximize profit. No.
Tim, creating a fairer business model.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more with those points. And the capture of the economy and financial institutions by private interest does lie at the heart of an economy that doesn't work at all. It's turned investment into a kind of casino. It's turned enterprise into forms of accumulation. It's turned work into a form of servitude. And it's turned the money system into a form of modern slavery. And that actually is exactly why you find in Barbados you don't have fiscal room. It's exactly why the pricing of things is not going to work entirely, Elliot. It's also why, sadly, even though I really enjoy the disclosure work that's being done, the disclosure is not in itself going to be enough. And I firmly believe this is not the time to throw away government. Of course, I was not arguing that government should do everything, but actually government does oversee the institutional rules that govern finance, that govern the monetary system, that govern the relationship between corporations and the state, and it is a social good to be allowed to set those institutions in ways that work for everybody rather than just a minority.
Elliot, before we go to the audience?
I will agree with that. I do think that is the role of government, to set the playing field and make sure it's even. Yeah? You were talking about government as a last employer. That's where I get a little worried, simply because of the challenge it poses to government. But again, I think we're moving towards a system where we want to unrig what you, Winnie, call a rigged economy and rig it in a different direction. Okay? But would it not be better to try and change the underlying business model so that it makes good business sense to be sustainable, so it makes good business sense to protect your workers, so it makes good business sense to be a responsible citizen? Now, if we can get that, then we have a self-motivating, self-perpetuating system. If, however, you need to have a government supervising every single individual decision that a business makes, then that government will soon go well past what it can achieve.
But that's not on the table. That
no,
was never
I understand that.
yeah.
But when we say we want to change the rigged system, the question is how. Now you can do it by directives and by regulations and by legislation, but only to a certain point. If, however, it's in the interest of the business to comply with the regulation, to seek out a form of behavior that is generating a suitable profit, but at the same time meeting the society's objectives in terms of protection for its citizens, good and decent employment, environmental protection, education for the children, health, and so on and so forth, then you have a system that can contain itself, that can carry itself. Now, I firmly do not believe that governments are in a capacity, and I'm speaking of governments across the world, to direct everything on a daily basis. We cannot do it.
Would you agree that at least as a first step, let's reduce the excessive voice of business in public policy? You know, companies spend so much money buying politics, buying public policy, setting the rules in their favor.
But if they do that, it is because the governments listen to them. The same governments you want to re-rig the system.
Exactly,
how are they going to do that?
That's what I'm saying. We reset the rules. Pharmaceutical companies paid in 2015 $250 million to politicians on Capitol Hill. The amount of money they put in campaigns. Let's first reduce the voice of business in public policy and raise the voice of ordinary people in public policy. The rules are set against dialogue. Ordinary people.
That's what I meant by dialogue. That you have business talking and making their input into policy, but on the other hand, evening the balance, you have labor, you have the representatives of the workers, you have the representatives of the ordinary man, also having their voice at the same table. So you're not going to say we don't want to hear from business, but we'll hear from business, but we even the scale. We will hear from labor, we'll hear from the man in the street, civil society, however they're represented, but we have to hear their voice so that when it all comes out, it's not only business that is achieving, and it's not only business that is benefiting, but it is the entire society that is benefiting as well.
In the spirit of including all voices in the conversation, we're going to turn to you. We will try and take some. Well, I just want to start with a couple of questions from two students at the Hertie School of Government here in Berlin. If they're in the audience, Jose Imer Campos. Here, if we could get a microphone to Jose here, and also to Isaac Joseph, who is back there. Thank you. If you would just stand to put your question to the panel, please.
Yeah, hello, my name is Jose Campos from the Hertie School of Governance. In this talk that we have discussed a new structure, a new global structure, and also you mentioned price as a, well, if the individual doesn't change behavior, if you tell them, maybe with the price, that's how we adapt the behavior. My question goes in this work to build a more inclusive and sustainable economy. A lot has been talked about carbon pricing. And it seems there's a general consensus on the effectiveness and need of this carbon pricing. But an international agreement right now on a single price really seems unlikely. Which specific approach to implement them should the world follow? Another international agreement, or just leave it to the discretion of national governments, or try to create a new agenda within business and governments to create this new structure towards this specific direction of carbon pricing?
Let's just pause on that for a second. Carbon pricing we've been talking about already. Let's answer that. Let's go to the next question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins, and thank you to Biyama for talking about climate change and talking about social justice, environmental justice. And my question is really about climate change, which is one of the greatest challenges of this century, as we all know. And now thinking more in terms of the environment as a global public good, what role do you think green taxes would or should play in achieving global social and environmental justice? Thank you.
Green taxes and carbon pricing. Tim, is there something you want to jump in on?
Yeah, very similar ideas, of course, and at their heart, absolutely sensible, because green taxes, essentially, the idea is that you tax bads rather than goods. I mean, we live in taxation systems which, broadly speaking, tax people's labor, which is something we want in the economy, and don't tax resource consumption or carbon or environmental damage or any of the other externalities that Elliot mentioned at the first instance. So the idea actually of internalizing, as economists like to say, internalizing the social costs into business decisions and into government decisions and into household decisions is absolutely right. And you have to be able to do that within a framework that makes sense in terms of fiscal responsibility. You have to also, and this is the thing that absolutely has not been happening, has held up green taxes and carbon pricing for decades, is you have to be able to bring business along into that discussion. And actually, the difficulty is that there are losers in that game, because there's a whole lot of businesses out there who are producing the impacts that are causing the social costs and at the same time taking profit from it. So the system as a whole ends up actually being a system in which you privatize all the benefits and you socialize all the costs, and that is absolutely at the heart of the inequality that we're trying to address. So both of those suggestions are absolutely profound. It does seem to me, though, that you're not going to get much progress in that until you somehow resolve this conundrum, which the panel actually has identified very early on, which is that government is held in hock by the interests of business, partly because of its own funding model and the money system that underlies it, which comes back, for me, to the point that I started with.
There is a huge issue here of climate injustice. There is a need to raise money that will go towards adaptation. Climate finance on the table now, only 16% goes to the adaptation needs of the poor countries, poor people who didn't in the first place cause climate change. So for me, it's very important that whether it is carbon taxing, whether it is public finance, that we prioritize resources for climate adaptation, for the poorest countries to be able to lift themselves out of poverty in a situation that's more complicated, that's further complicated by climate change. Things are changing, and there are signs of hope. We are seeing developing countries taking this challenge and being more in the lead than even the rich countries who are the cause of climate change. We're seeing more innovation, commitment. It seems that China has peaked in emissions. India is making progress in the solar area. South Africa is now one of the 10 leading innovators in solar technology. So we're seeing a lot of developing countries moving and emerging economies taking the lead. But we don't see the rich countries taking the responsibility they should take to reduce carbon emissions. 2.7 degrees in the Paris Agreement is still a recipe for catastrophe, because we know that beyond 2 degrees warming, we're going to have catastrophic impacts. So for me, again, it's a challenge it's a challenge of justice, environmental justice, that the rich countries, the rich companies step up to the plate.
Ellie, we'll come to you. Esther, green taxes, carbon pricing, is this going to help? Barbados?
Well, it's something that we're trying in Barbados because just like Winnie said, you know, Barbados and the small islands of the Caribbean, we are hardly producers of greenhouse gases. But because we're small islands, because we're in the middle of the sea, you know, just 1 centimeter of sea level rise can destroy our coastline, which for us is our source of income, because between fisheries and tourism, we depend on our oceans. And any climate, any sea level rise will affect us. Global warming is affecting our coral reefs already, and we're seeing the impact that that is having on the quality of some of our beaches, and the impact that it is having on the fishing as well. Our fisher folk will tell you that they're noticing differences when they fish. The problem is, because over the last, Barbados is now 50 years independent, and over the last 50 years, we have done a lot in developing our nation. We're still a developing nation, yes, but we are ranked in the UN Human Development Index. We are ranked as a high development. And we've made a lot of progress. And so we have graduated from concessionary financing and funding, from World Bank, from their loans and so on. But any catastrophe, any disaster that is occasioned by climate change can wipe us out, turn back our development 50 years, you know, 70 years even. And that's an argument that we've been trying to make to those agencies. Don't just look at what our GDP is now. Don't just look at what our HDI, Human Development Index, is now. Understand the vulnerability. We are still very, very, very vulnerable. We are doing our best to improve ourselves, but we are vulnerable through no fault of our own. You know, as Winnie said, we are not the ones that produce the greenhouse gases, but already we are seeing the effects. And so we've had to put a lot of our resources, even though we've been battling through the recession, we've still had to say that work has to continue in terms of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. We've had to put a lot of emphasis in that. We've had to reform our economy to a green economy. It's a transition process, we're still there. But the reason we have to do that and not wait until our GDP is where we want it to be is because it cannot wait. It is urgent. We have to do that now. And we need the folks with the money, the World Bank and all the other agencies to say, sure, they're high income, we're high middle income, but they still need assistance because they do have that vulnerability that's not going anywhere.
Elliot.
Thank you, Robert. I think coming back to the question of a global approach to carbon pricing, I think that is going to be very difficult to achieve because one fact remains, fiscal policy, taxation in particular, is something that governments don't like to share. They like to reserve for themselves the right to make their own policies without having to follow a rule from somewhere else. And that's very, very difficult to overcome. I do think that there will be more and more examples as we go along of countries that in their own interest start to tax carbon. That generates resources that they can use for other forms of adaptation, for social policies to ease the transition away from the fossil fuel economy to the decarbonized economy. And hopefully that experience, that example, will encourage latecomers to join the party. But I don't see very much scope for a global agreement. Now, that said, what I do believe in firmly, and even though I represent the UN here and we tend to deal with governments more than with the private sector, I do tend to think that markets are pretty powerful things. And fact of life is that there are 3 billion people on this planet who are horrendously underserved in terms of energy. Access to energy, and the energy they do have access to is the kind of energy we want to get rid of. But happily, we live in a time where there are alternatives. There are technologies that now can respond to the need to provide clean and renewable energy access to even the poorest. And that is a massive market. And you can either sit back and say, well, we won't do it, and then you miss the train, or you can get engaged in that market and drive the new trend forward. Yeah? And I think that that is precisely where we should be encouraging progress. Yes, there is tremendous climate injustice, but it's not the rich countries that are going to change things. It's not the rich governments that are going to change things. It is the way in which people respond to the challenges that are out there. And in many respects, I'm very optimistic that we will find ways in which we can deploy technology, change the way we operate, move towards patterns of consumption and production that are more sustainable, because it makes sense, not on some global level, but because it makes sense in our individual lives, because it improves the bottom line of the individual business that saves on its resources and is more energy efficient in its production, and that when we start seeing that, it will create a demonstration effect that will make others who are hesitant, or others who don't believe, or others who are just sheer contrary, they will start to understand that it is not in their own interests to let that train leave the station without them. That is where I think we would have the greatest chance of success. We can sit and debate about who caused climate change until, well, the sea level rises and drowns all of us in the Caribbean. Or we can go ahead and change what we can change now, demonstrate that it works, and create a positive momentum for us to just move forward with it. The time has gone long past to point fingers and assign blame. Let's work on the solutions.
Let's take a couple more questions. Yes, sir, there, and then lady at the back in the middle.
First there were 2 hands.
Thank you. I'm Ravi Chaudhary from India. I thought, let me get back to the first 3 words of your question. How can we? Firstly, I think we can, if we have the passion and if we have the commitment. Now, I want to make 4 quick bullet points. 1, what is not measured never gets done. Now, is it possible to start ranking the performance of nations by computing the per capita GDP growth of the bottom 80% of the people? Now, I think that is something which has not been done, but is doable, I believe. And I think that's where our focus has to be. The second point was that a lot of dialogue is on changing the global system, creating a new global ecosystem. I think we forget that the greatest obstacles to progress lie not outside, but within the country.
Yeah.
And I think it's time each nation starts looking at it inside. And the third point is that why is it not happening? And I think Winnie made a very good point that there is a strong business politics nexus, and we can't hide it, and nor can they. Most of the global decisions, whether it's G20 or G7 or United Nations, are made on the premise that if big business doesn't make money, it doesn't get done. Now, in such an environment, a nation can certainly start focusing on small and medium enterprises. And I think that's where the jobs will come. We can't legislate minimum wages. We can't create jobs unless we create multitudes of entrepreneurs at the lower levels of our societies. And they don't need much money. They need small amounts of money at the same rate of interest as the biggest lenders get. So typically, microfinance is considered as a great thing, but the interest rates for microfinance are 3 times to 4 times than the Fortune 500 companies get. Now, this is something which can be done by the banks in the nation itself. I don't think we should wait for global system to change. And finally, a very little philosophic comment that, you know, we grew from hunter's economy to industrial economy to information economy and knowledge economy. Now, the problem with knowledge economy is that those who have knowledge don't have power, and those who have power don't have knowledge.
Especially now.
And even those who have power and knowledge are not willing to share power and knowledge. I foresee the need to shift to the next phase, which I call wisdom economy, which is based on 2 principles, compassion and transparency. If leaders are transparent, they will have to be compassionate. And I think that is where the future lies for us, and we can build inclusive and sustainable economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello there. Thank you for the discussion today. My name is Emma Krause. I'm also a student at the Hertie School of Governance. I wanted to pick up a little bit on the conversation between business and government, specifically the linkage between the two, and how government can encourage business to go the right direction. I agree with Elliot that it has to come from the market, but I also agree with Winnie that it won't work if the government isn't involved. And I'm curious how that works. Is it national policies? Is it regional agreements such as BEPS trying to address tax evasion? Is it subnational agreements between governments that focus on the same policies when they have similar issues, even if they're not, the same nations? I'm curious what you think about that. Thank you.
Okay. Should things be done internationally, intergovernmentally, or should the momentum for everything come from countries themselves? Is that it, Lodge? No? Sorry, let's just get the question right. Sorry.
I spoke for a long time. I'm curious as to how government and business interact with each other. How do governments make business go in the direction that we want it to go? Mm-hmm. And does that have to happen through the normal frameworks that we've been seeing? Or is there a different opportunity?
Okay. Is there a different way of business and government working together? Esther?
Well, the short answer is that all of the scenarios that she described actually must happen. She asked if it will happen at a subnational level, nationally, regionally, and so on. And all of those are important, and there's a role for all of those particular interactions. But how can government get business to play along? To paraphrase what she said, usually, as I mentioned earlier, it tends to be that he who pays the piper calls the tune, so that we find, for example, in Barbados, when the businesses come, whether they're local or foreign businesses, they tend to say, well, I'm going to be bringing you so much jobs, and this is the amount of money that I'm investing, therefore I want ABC. And governments tend to roll out the red carpet and say, okay, fine, you come along, you can do that. And by the way, that environmental impact assessment can we not pay too much attention to what's happening, what that says? And I'm not saying that this happens in Barbados, but but that kind of thing happens. You would hear across governments that, well, can we not put so much emphasis or so much weight on this particular report in the environmental impact assessment? And especially for governments who are trying to achieve some growth, governments which in the last decade have not had more than very anemic growth. It's tempting to say, well, okay, we need the money, we need the growth, we need whatever jobs you are bringing. It is tempting. But this is why I come back to the point that you need somebody to, and not just the global referee, but we need, I always come back to dialogue, because when that arrangement then comes to for the oversight of a tripartite grouping, then somebody can say, but hold on, what's happening here? What about the people? What about the society? What about the jobs? What about the wages? Okay, so there needs to be that, because if left unchecked, he who pays the piper will call the tune, and we have seen that too much, and it has been to the detriment of our societies.
Elliot, you're going to come in, and then Winnie will come to you immediately.
Okay.
Thanks, Robert. I think that's quite correct. But let's start by accepting that a business will always try to find the most favorable conditions to operate. It's business. That's how they operate. If they didn't operate that way, you'd be suspicious. Let's start from the presumption also that it is the role of government to set a predictable framework within which business operates, and that framework should include the social objectives of this society, the environmental objectives, and those are the rules. The work that we've been doing in UN Environment with the business community has shown that they understand that there are going to be regulations, there are going to be taxes, there are going to be laws that they have to undertake, but what they want is predictability. If it is predictable, if it is there, they can manage it into their business models. Yeah? I think once we have that kind of it's not a balance, but if we have that sort of a framework for the operations, then it becomes somewhat easier for a government to say, well, we're terribly sorry, but the conditions under which you want to bring money here, these are not the conditions that we want to accept. Thank you very much. No, thank you very much. There is enough money out there to finance all of the activities of developing countries on the terms and conditions that the developing countries want, provided it makes sense from the business perspective as well.
Educated people.
Exactly right. And I think that that is the key point here, is that we have to understand that we should not expect business to come in and take over the role of government. No. Government plays the rules. This is what happens. There are governments that don't have that capacity. Perhaps partners can help them build up that capacity. There are governments that are not as committed, if you will, to the welfare of their citizens, unfortunate as it may be. But it is the role of government to set the framework and to make sure that framework matches the objectives of the society. Nobody else. And if we can get that going, I think we can manage to move the money. Winnie?
I think we need to understand that we are at a different point from where we were 40 years ago. We have an extreme form of shareholder capitalism, as I've just said. Governments are preoccupied with growth, GDP growth, and that masks poverty and the conditions of people and even the environment that is being destroyed. Businesses are preoccupied with profit for their shareholders and nothing else. It wasn't always like this, and it doesn't have to be like this. We can have businesses, and we are seeing it. I was in Davos at the beginning of this year at the World Economic Forum. I saw businessmen and women, mostly men, frightened, actually traumatized by the events of 2016. The political anger in the middle classes in the North was shocking these business people. And I was hearing them say, we need new metrics. We have to change the way business is done, but we need new metrics from our shareholders, because we are required to deliver a profit in a short time and shares to our shareholders. Unless this changes, we will not be able to respond to the political anger. So now, this means, I also saw it in the climate change process. I saw business take the lead from governments. I saw business forming groups and saying the way we do business is bad for the long-term future of our businesses. It's bad for society, for people. It's bad for the environment. Let's change. And different groupings started being formed of business leaders who want a world where there's a win for everybody. So I really, and so when we talk about business and say business will always want a profit, I don't agree. Business wants benefits for the shareholder, for the society, for the environment, for the consumer, for everybody. That's the business we want. Equally, governments must take the wisdom of Justice Brandeis of the United States Supreme Court, who once said that you can have democracy or you can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but you can't have both. Leaders must now run governments and take a distance from business and do public policy for the benefit of everybody.
Who are the biggest investors in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Mozambique? These are not big companies, these are the Chinese, and this is not the big Chinese shareholder wanting to make profit. This is politics. This is politics. And I was in Mozambique, in the northern of Mozambique, where they have a lot of gas, a lot of things, and I said, that's great. And there are buildings, and they said, and I talked to the premier of this northern part and said, that's great, the people will be lucky to see. Oh no, he said, because for the next 10 years, this is our problems, they will not get anything. I said, why? Well, we had to make concessions to the Chinese, that they don't pay tax, that they bring their own people, and said, why did you do this? Yeah. Well, this was not the big shareholders with the big money.
Excuse me.
You are very one-sided, I must really say.
Let's take Arriva. Arriva is a French company. It has been mining uranium in Niger for more than 30 years, taking uranium to make energy to light up homes and industries in France. The people of Niger are in total darkness. Niger decided to now change its tax code and remove the tax holidays, the low royalty tax, whatever, and made a law to make companies, all companies, pay their fair share. Arriva said, we will close and go because we want to continue paying almost no tax. The people of Niger stood up, civil society, ordinary peasants said, no, enough is enough, you must pay your fair share. We supported them. Today, Niger gets $30 billion more from its bauxite, from its uranium, because of the tax code that it has brought in. You can't keep saying Chinese companies, European companies. It's business all over the world, working in an environment where the rules have been rigged, whether they are tax rules, intellectual property rules. We are not here to point fingers at one country or another. We really must just honestly look at the global system and make it better for all. It's not about China versus European companies, no. It's a global system that is rigged.
You are pointing fingers there. All the evening you are pointing fingers on a special group.
No, I didn't.
We are going to give a final, unfortunately time is against us this evening. We are going to ask each of you for a final thought to sum up. We've had calls for the world needs a global referee to mediate between governments, private sector. Anybody who wants to apply for that, please let Paige know over the next 2 days. Share not just wealth, but knowledge and education with developing economies, we've heard. Let women take a greater share of the working environment. Global tax reform. Business can do good for everyone. That's its fundamental goal, arguably. A final word from each of you, please. Jürgen, we will start with you.
I will be the last one.
I'm afraid you have to go first.
I would suggest to take not go globally and wait until we got a tax agreement globally. This will not work. But if we talk of Africa, because this is a special theme of the G20, I would suggest to take 2 or 3 countries and make a deal with them, educate the government, get from the government the confirmation that there's no corruption, get some big and small companies and to help them to build up a society where everybody can participate and build up small and medium-sized enterprises in these countries. I see this a problem for UNICEF when I see where the stuff is bought, that the mosquito nets and so on, mostly comes from China. Said, why don't you buy this in Africa? Well, we have to take the lowest bidder. This is UN things, and mostly this comes from Bangladesh or comes from China. So, I mean, this is so stupid, and I'm not so happy with the UN all together. They are competing in the countries and so on. UNICEF is doing quite well, I think, especially in Germany. And so I think we cannot wait for a global agreement. We have to be in dialogue. This is what G20 does and what B20 does try. But we have to put examples that it works and not only talking and show. This is, I think in Rwanda, not everything is good, but many things are good in Rwanda. And take some of these not too big countries, maybe not Nigeria, which is difficult, smaller countries, and this is an example how we can. And then we go forward.
Elliot, letting small businesses, developing economies work for themselves. How can the UN help?
Well, I think sharing good practice. There is an awful lot that's going on in the world today. And I mean, that has become clearer and clearer to us as we look at what's happening in renewable energy, as we look at what's happening in the financial markets. We see that there is a lot of innovation. People are moving into greater consideration of issues of sustainability and trying to work it into the way they do their day-to-day affairs. Now, this starts with my 9-year-old son now, who insists that I should buy an electric vehicle. I won't say which brand. I'm not allowed to do that as a representative of the UN. But he harasses me every time he sees one in the road. Daddy, Daddy, you need to get one of those. Because it looks good, but because he understands also nothing comes out of the back of it. He always puts that bit of the argument into it. But we also see it happening in the financial sector, where the insurance companies have spent the last 20 years learning how to assess climate risk, because it's Lebenswichtig. It is absolutely essential for them. They cannot survive unless they know how to manage that risk. That is permeating the entire financial sector. But you also then see the large and small enterprises are moving into sustainability. You have the Unilevers of the world, and you have the small ones that are operating in developing countries and are taking new approaches to providing the resources they need to produce and managing their waste and using that as a selling point for their clientele. I tell people who come to see me in New York, look, our job is it's a holding action, is to prevent things from getting so bad that they can't fix it. If we do that, if we succeed in that, the next generation is going to be able to fix it all. We have the technology, we have the awareness, and we have the commitment to do so. But we will not do it by sitting down to figure out, well, who is to blame and who should be taking the lead, because it's in each and every individual's interest that we progress on this sustainability agenda, and I'm perfectly convinced we'll succeed. Thanks.
Esther.
Yes. Whose prosperity? How can we build inclusive and sustainable economies? One thing we know in Barbados is that a rising tide will not float all boats. There has to be a targeted approach by government, and this is the role of government, to ensure that the achievements, the gains are for all, that there is inclusive growth, that there is sustainability environmentally, socially, economically. That has to be the role of government. We have a number of success stories in Barbados that I didn't have the opportunity to share, and sadly I won't be able to do that now. But you know, we have aimed at, and we've set for ourselves a vision, a Barbados that is socially balanced, environmentally sound, economically viable, and characterized by good governance. And so a government has to take the role that we're going to look at all of these. We are going to ensure the society benefits, that there's balance, social justice, that there's economic growth, and that the economy, that the environment does not lose out. As I said, as a small island developing state, we can't play with that. We have a lot of success stories in renewable energy and climate change. But I believe that, and it's the point I've made through and through, that as a government, we have to ensure that anybody doing business in Barbados is made aware of what the stakes are, made aware of the fact that, yes, we want your money. We do business with the Chinese as well, but we've had to say, for example, you're not getting 100% of the jobs. We want some, and we negotiated, and we got some. I think we got 40% of the jobs on the last project, which, you know, compared to a job that a neighboring island got recently, the Chinese got 100% of the jobs. We got 40%. Our union said, hey, you should have gotten 80%, but, you know, hopefully next time. So through dialogue, we hope that we will, that everybody doing business in Barbados will understand that there is a new model of doing business which ensures that capital will gain, which ensures that there's decent work for all, and which ensures that the processes that are involved in that business are sustainable with little or no impact on the environment and on our resources. That has to be the ultimate goal, and governance, as government, we have to keep our eyes on that target.
Tim.
Yeah, it's funny how we live by these kind of aphorisms for decades. A rising tide will lift all boats. I mean, where on earth did that idea come from? And maybe it's time to transform it. A rising sea level will sink us all. Yeah. Something along those lines. Well, here's another one. The business of business is business, said Milton Friedman. The business of business is profit, as though that were the end of everything and we couldn't talk about business anymore in any other way. But actually we can. We can talk about business as purpose. And there are lots of people people trying to do that. There are people in all sorts of places thinking about business as purpose. Some of those are young generation of enthusiastic people who don't have their eye solely on profit, who don't have their eye solely on shareholder capitalism, who have their eye on social change, on doing something useful in the world to make it a better place. Those transformations are absolutely possible, but only, I think, in the context of a strong ideal of governance. And I do not think that we should throw that away. I think it is not the time to throw government away. Governments have done good things. Government, in association with business, has brought the cost of photovoltaics down to within reach and sometimes below the cost of fossil fuels. Governments got together in Paris and signed the Paris Agreement. Governments got together all over the world and negotiated the Sustainable Development Goals. These were real social gains. They were social progress, and they were prosecuted, yes, with the help of business, yes, with the help of people, but also with the help of strong government, strong notions of governance. You asked us, Robert, at the beginning to say something at the end that we'd like to have happen differently in the next 5 years. And I suppose my one ask there is look at that wonderful triumph of the SDGs, putting those targets in place to change the way in which we approach development. There's just one tiny thing wrong with it, which is SDG 8, which I'm sure you all know off by heart. It puts decent work together with growth. They are not the same thing. Growth is not equal to jobs. We've seen it everywhere. Jobs in themselves are not equal to decent work. Decent work is about participation. It's about improving the quality of people's lives. It is not just a right, but it is a duty of government to be able to provide that for people across their nations. And so I would come back to that question that we left a little bit in the lurch. Is there a role for these changes at the level of national government? Yes, I do believe that there is, and it is the national government that has the ability to create the wisdom economy and to put compassion and transparency at the heart of development.
I agree with everything Tim says. 3 things. 1, we need rules set by those whom we elect, our governments, at the national level, at the global level. The rules are rigged and we need to reset them. So we need governments. We need governments, rules to do with taxation, rules to do with intellectual property rights, rules to do with climate change. We need to have governments and intergovernmental bodies that do their role. We need to have ideas on which the economy is based. I think the idea of profit, the idea of an economy that responds to the rational economic man is flawed. We now need to think of an economy and factor in the fact that, for example, the idea that the planet is sacred. It's sacred. It's what we have and given to us, and we should not treat it just like rubbish in an economic model that we have today. Women, the idea that women are can work and produce work that is not costed, that is not rewarded, is part of this economic model. And that's why women are at the bottom of the heap in this economy. So we need to change the ideas on which our economy is based and have an economy that respects the planet, that treats men and women equally, and that we all benefit from. So that's ideas are important. And the third thing is politics. We must have politics where the voices of the majority win, not the voices of those with money and technology, as we have today, where public policy is in the hands of those who control capital. So we need now to have deep, good politics where we all have a stake. So for me, it's about the rules, the global rules matter, global governance, national governance matters. It's about the way politics is done in shaping those rules. Rules matter, the way the rules are made matters, and it's also about the ideas on which the economy is founded. Thank you.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you from Intelligence Squared. Thank you, our audience, for your excellent questions. Thank you to the Green Growth Knowledge Platform for setting up tonight's event. Thank you to Page Berlin 2017 for having us. And thank you to the Ministry for the Environment here in Berlin for hosting this evening in these spectacular settings. And thank you, above all, to our distinguished and extremely inspiring panel.
And to you too, our moderator.